Welcome to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for joining us. Well, for those of us who weren't around during the Vietnam War or were too little to remember, it might be hard to imagine what that time was like for members of the military. And while today we routinely celebrate our vets and work to provide the services they need when they come home, that was not the case for veterans of Vietnam. And because of that, Vietnam vets have a different experience healing even 50 years later. Darren Farr with the local VA and veteran Jim McLean are here now to talk about all of that. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so we are 50 years out from 1968, which I understand was one of the more pivotal years during the Vietnam issue. So describe for me what it was like during that time for the vets returning home from that.
It was very difficult. Veterans were looked upon as, in fact, a lot of veterans were looked upon as baby killers. It was very politicized. Everything was political. Kind of like, in a way, it is now. Everything is political. Then there was marching in the streets, and I laugh and say that I was kind of fortunate because I was shot and medevaced back to San Diego, the hospital in San Diego, and I had to put up with less than a lot of my brothers did, because San Diego was a very military-friendly town.
What was the worst of it, the worst stories that you heard?
Worst stories, being spit at, not being served in restaurants. It was, a lot of veterans were ashamed of being veterans. They were ashamed of being, that they went over there and they did their duty. No matter what politics were involved, they were ashamed.
And whether they had volunteered themselves or whether they were forced into it, right?
There were a certain number of draftees. I know that I went in the Marine Corps before I could get a draft card. I went straight from high school into, I was in boot camp, turned 18. I was in Vietnam when I was 19. So it was, at that time, looking at the military was a lot different than now it's better. The veterans are treated better. Military is, it is nothing to be able to say, hey, thanks for your service. Didn't happen back then.
Right. And back then, you know, we didn't even have the words to describe what, for example, PTSD is something that came about after, right? Or at least the name for it?
I think a lot more research went into the mental health from that generation because it was so prevalent at the time. The horrors that these men and women saw in country, they came back, and then if you couple that with the socioeconomic dynamic they were experiencing when they came home, that can be a very good trigger for a lot of emotional responses and things like that. So I think what we learned as a society was that maybe we want to research and study this a little more. And so we'd always had different terms. Going back to World War I, they called it shell shock. And then, you know, they got into World War II and they had a different name for it. They called it battle fatigue. But it wasn't until Vietnam that the term post-traumatic stress was actually coined and used as the standard for what they look at now.
Correct? Right. And in a lot of ways, seeing people go through that experience has kind of changed the way we handle our military now when they return from deployment, right?
There are so many correlations that we look at from Jim's generation and my father served there too, of things that we learned and lessons that we learned from what those men and women went through, and then of course the benefits and services that they fought for the last 50 years that the men and women getting out of the service now actually benefit from. The lessons learned about, you know, the outreach and the mental health treatment, to even looking at things like, you know, they were the first generation that really raised the alarm, if you will, for environmental exposures for things like Agent Orange and all the diseases and conditions that were affiliated or associated with what they call presumptive to that. Now it's even, and some of these men went 20, 30 years trying to prove their case until it was finally, you know, proven that yes, that's what's going on. And it's shortened that timeline now when you look at the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans with the burn pits and with other things that they're exposed to, environmental toxins. Even my generation, I was in Desert Storm, and I have friends that I served with that we went through the oil field fires, and every single one of us has some type of issue that's a residual from that. But the process is getting a lot faster because we're realizing that with proactive health care, that's also evolved. We're keeping people on the battlefield alive longer, so when they come back, now the VA has to really step in and look at, they're still going to have issues that we have to work with that other people their age aren't going to, if that makes sense.
So for the Vietnam vets specifically, what are the services that have been most beneficial for you guys?
Boy, I tell you what, I have mixed feelings about the VA. I have had my challenges, like his father had with the VA. And I tried a couple of times, and then I decided, okay, I'll give it a try again. And that was about 10 years ago. I found that I'm still not sure about the VA. It's a bureaucracy, but I love the people over at the VA hospital. I find that it is less the bureaucracy and what they're supposed to do, and the fact that they actually want to be there and help veterans. And for me, as a Vietnam veteran, I finally started to learn more about why I was doing things that I was doing. And that, again, turns us right around to PTSD and those kind of things.
So then would you encourage any Vietnam vet who had that bad experience and totally wrote off the VA to reach out again?
You betcha. You betcha. I think that it's a lot of angry Vietnam vets out there. There really are. I see them at the VA hospital all the time, and they have a right to be angry.
Absolutely.
It's just that they don't need to be angry at these folks, because these folks are actually trying to help them. So I have whether I agree with everything that happens, I have a very, very high feeling for the folks at the VA hospital here at Reno.
All right, and speaking of trying to help, I understand there's a special event coming up specifically for Vietnam vets. Tell me about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So on March 23rd at the El Dorado Hotel, they were very gracious. The folks over there lent us a room to screen a special movie called 84 Charlie Mopic. It's a very, very poignant and powerful film, and it was written and directed by an actual Vietnam veteran and based on his experiences there. So what we thought of this year was, if we wanted to get a conversation started about the experiences that these men and women went through, why not do it in a way that evokes emotional response that this movie will do, but we'll do it as a VIP screening for the film. And the audience, the VIPs, are the Vietnam veterans and their families. And in some ways, Jim and I have talked about this, the film is less about speaking to the actual veterans that were there, because they're going to recognize and see those things and go, yeah, I remember that. But in a way, the film will actually help their loved ones understand the things these guys can't always talk about or verbalize. And that's the most powerful part of that, is that they'll finally see and understand a lot of things that, Dad or my husband couldn't say, and now I get it, And so we do know that the film can be a trigger in some ways for some of those memories that they don't want to re-experience. So we'll have mental health counselors on standby there to talk with anybody who's having emotional response to it. But it's a good outreach tool, because the conversation needs to be had. And the more you keep that in, as he said, the anger goes with that, So, and I was telling Jim, bring my own father out for it, because he's one of those guys that doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't like talking about it. But he'll agree with Jim on one respect, is that I'm just now learning later in my life. He's told me, the mistakes I made that I didn't pay attention to that are now making sense to me. So that's the key takeaway from it. So,
okay. Do you find it really hard to talk about your time there?
Sometimes, on some things, you betcha, sure. But with that kind of syndrome, you can smell something, you can taste something, you can hear something, and it'll bring back memories that will trigger things. But normally I don't mind, because it was part of something that I did And it was a long time ago. It was a lot of years ago.
Yeah, it was a lot of years ago, and I think because of that, probably a lot of people today don't really have a full understanding of the situation. It's been 50 years, and I'd imagine probably a lot of the viewers either weren't alive or were too young to really remember everything that went on. So probably more important than ever to kind of remind people this is an important part of our history.
And it's, yeah, you're right, and it's important that that history not be lost. And because it wasn't talked about, because of the things we talked about that happened when they came home, a lot of people want to push that to the past and move on. But as we know, that's not healthy for anybody involved with it, whether you had a loved one there or you were the actual veteran. So one of the things that we hope to evoke from it too is that after we screen the film, the cast and crew of the film will actually be there to interact with the group. And the director, Patrick Duncan, finds it very important for him. The screenwriting and the making the film was an expression. It was how he was able to cathartically deal with his own emotions, was to write it out, let it, and as he'll tell you, all types of art are born from pain, right? And in this way, that was for him, it was to get that out there. So he's very excited to come and meet with, as he called it, his brethren who were there, who are going to really appreciate what he's bringing to the table.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time, but just quickly, the public is invited to come to this, right? And once again, when and where? It's
March 23rd, Friday evening, and it's in the downstairs ballroom at the El Dorado. Obviously, we want to focus on the priority being for our Vietnam veterans and their families, but of course it is open to the public. And as we say, there's no charge for the event because that price has already been paid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say? 30 seconds left. Anything you would want people to know?
Come see it, come interact, come talk to each other, and come see what the VA has to offer.
You betcha. The VA is actually trying to do some good stuff. I'm surprised at times.
That's good to hear. All right, thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, well, coming up on Face the State, we have a limited number of places to turn to in the Truckee Meadows for mental health and addiction care, but that number just got a little larger. I'll find out about a new hospital and how it could help you or someone you know right after the break.